Welcome back to episode 4 of Say It Louder, the podcast where we speak the unspeakable and encourage victims and survivors to reclaim their voices. I am your host, Selena Waterman-Smith. In episode 3, we had delved into the trial for my kidnapping and sexual assault in the Emirates. And to be honest, all of that was really heavy. It was heavy for me to talk about. And it was probably very heavy for you to listen to. So I'm going to dive into this episode with something a bit more lighthearted, and I'm going to tell you a funny story. Actually, it's not a funny story at all, but I use dark humour to cope with trauma, and you're along for the ride, so I'm going to go into this. While I was trying to get mental health support in that part of the world, I think around the time that I'd been given a travel ban and this crazy alcohol drinking charge, I was really in a low point and a point of extreme stress and fear, and it all become too much for me. And I had tried to find therapists and counselors, but nobody would talk to me. People just said, we don't do things like rape, we don't work with trauma. It was so taboo. And I was really just trying to get something. I can't believe that I went through that experience and I wasn't medicated. I was just out there raw dogging reality and dealing with all this trauma. So I went to a hospital and I went to the reception and I said, I'm trying to get mental health support. Maybe I need antidepressants or anti-anxiety tablets or something to help me through this process. And there was an Arabic lady behind the counter and she asked me why. And I said, I'm going through this rape trial and it's requiring all of my mental resources and faculties and I'm really struggling. And, she asked me a few questions and she said, one of the questions was, do you feel suicidal? And to be honest, at times, yes, 100% I felt that way because it was so huge and terrifying and I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. I didn't know if I was going to end up being jailed. There are times in my life, not only then where I felt like that is the only way out, when you become that desperate. So I, answered her questions and she filled out this checklist and she said, okay, come with me. And she led me to a hospital bed, which I thought was a bit strange. And she said, okay, we're going to send someone in to see you. And then this large African security guard, this female security guard came and stood by my hospital bed. And I went to get up to use the bathroom or something. And she said, no, you have to stay where you are. And I suddenly realized that something bad was about to happen. Again, more bad things. And this security guard wouldn't let me up from the bed. She wouldn't let me leave. And an Australian female doctor came in. And honestly, shame on her. Because she said that she had looked at my chart, this quick chart that I'd taken at reception. And she had decided that I had no protective instinct. And that I was clearly a risk to myself. And she wanted to section me under some sort of mental health law. First of all, people are not charts, people are people, and they have a range of complex emotions. And I dispute any kind of assessment where you can ask someone a series of basic questions and make those sort of determinations about them. Equally, it's completely illogical to expect that if I don't have protective instincts, I would be going through my own rape trial. That implies that I have very strong protective instincts towards myself and survival instincts. And what I was looking for then is support and empathy, which was once again denied to me and probably is denied to all victims. You are just not given a goddamn thing when you go through these scenarios. So she wanted to section me in some sort of Dubai mental health institution. So I called this lawyer friend, Amelia, who was kind of my guardian angel throughout this scenario, and she called the lady from the volunteer charity, and they came storming down to the hospital on my behalf. And they kept me there for like 6 hours, and they were literally saying, we're going to put you in this mental hospital. And basically, if you go into a mental hospital in that part of the world, they inject you with lithium. And the only person that could have signed me out would have been my husband or my immediate family member. And I didn't have any immediate family. So Amelia was saying, if you go in there, you'll never come out. And we were almost in hysterics of laughter. I think the situation was that traumatic. And this sometimes happens to people. They report that in really extreme scenarios where things are not funny at all, people start laughing uncontrollably. And we were like they wanted to handcuff me to a hospital bed because I'd said that I had had suicidal thoughts because I was going through something that was extremely traumatic, and they wanted to put me in a mental institute. Never mind giving me some support, maybe just a bit of Prozac would have helped me out. But no, we're going to punish this rape victim even more. So they stood guard, Amelia and this other lady stood guard around my hospital bed and refused to let them take me. And this kind of standoff went on for several hours. And eventually, Amelia had to sign a paper from the hospital. And it was like a declaration saying that if I killed myself, she would be responsible for me. She was liable for my life. And that she would be prosecuted for suicide because under Sharia law, suicide is haram and it's actually against the law. If you try to commit suicide in the Emirates, you will be prosecuted. Well, you will be prosecuted if you don't unalive yourself. If you actually fail and you wake up, then you'll be prosecuted. And this happened very recently in a case of a lady called Tori Towie, who was an Irish national who was a victim of extreme domestic violence, and they arrested her and tried to prosecute her for attempting suicide. And she was actually let go because of public scrutiny and Western media coverage. So anyway, back then in the dark days of 2012, they thought they were going to put me in hospital, and if not, Amelia was going to be responsible for my life. And she actually had to sign a document and give them a copy of her passport, which is a huge thing that she's essentially taking my life into her hands. And then the hospital let us go. And I still didn't have any Prozac or Xanax or any type of mental health support. And all I wanted was, just a little something. I probably just needed a hug. And when we got out of the hospital, again, we were kind of hysterically laughing. We were so buoyed up on different types of stress emotions, and couldn't believe that had happened. And we kind of escaped out into the car park, and we all went home. And again, tried to carry on with my life, tried to keep up this facade like everything was so perfect and wonderful in Dubai. So, as I said, that story wasn't funny at all, but I do use dark humour to get me through these periods. And if you're a trauma survivor, it would be great if you could establish some anchoring techniques to find a way to make yourself laugh about things that are traumatic. This has to happen after your healing period. When you're in the middle of something really traumatic, you have to process your emotions first, and you have to honour the extreme emotions that you're feeling at the time. But later, as a way of severing that traumatic connection to that memory, this is something that I do as an NLP practitioner, you can create an anchoring technique where you make yourself laugh, essentially, when you're recounting it. So that was one way that I dealt with some of the situations I was going through. Now, anyway, back to the trial. So I had testified. I'd heard this taxi driver testimony. I'd heard testimony from other people. It was very obvious why these men were charged with kidnapping and gang rape. And I think it was also mentioned at the trial that they found footage of me on their mobile phones. It made me feel really sick to think about the footage on the phones. And I wonder if in some way the reason why I didn't pressure the CID for copies of legal documents is because I don't think I ever want to see the photos and the footage of myself from that night. And I also wanted to add that when the taxi driver came in to testify, he came in his uniform. So this man that had sold me to rapists and taken a bribe and gone on his merry way and not reported anything had not even been fired from his job. Why would someone not be fired from that position? It should really tell you everything you need to know about the powers that be, that they don't think, his employer, which is Dubai government, don't think there's anything wrong with what he did. And on the one hand, I'm happy that he was still in the country and he was able to testify, but it is sickening to think that this has probably happened to other women. I mean, I know it's happened to other women with these particular Iranian men. I wonder if maybe there's even more to the story that I wasn't privy to. Perhaps the men had a deal with taxi drivers. Perhaps they had a deal with men behind the bar. I still don't know how and when my drink was spiked. Was it the barman? Were these men in the bar? Did they manage to do it somehow? Do they have deals with taxi drivers where if the taxi driver picks up an unconscious woman that's been drugged, that they have certain meeting points and the men will just take the girl out of the taxi? I think there's a lot more to the story that I'll probably never know. But I am pleased to report that with my case, the men were convicted of kidnapping and rape, which is an impossible result. I don't know of any other cases that are recorded where a woman has got that kind of result in Dubai. So it is kind of landmark and groundbreaking, and still shocks me to this day, especially when I read that to this day women are still arrested when they report it. But with my case, they were convicted and they were sentenced to 10 years in jail. And after the 10-year jail sentence, they get deported. So I knew, not only had I been exonerated from any type of victim blame, I knew that these men were never, ever going to harm a woman in Dubai ever again. That's just Mouse. She's a little bit camera shy, but I wanted to break up the trauma of the story that I'm telling. For those of you who are listening to this on Spotify or Apple, my cat just jumped on my lap while we were filming, providing us with some much needed light-hearted respite. So I'll dive back into when I received the details about the conviction. And we had to wait after the testimonies. We weren't summoned to hearing the judgment, but it would be posted in the court. Really bizarrely, all of the court judgments are posted on pieces of paper which are just stuck up on like a clipboard, and you have to go and relate your case number to the judgment. So I went down with this lady from the charity that was kind of unofficially assisting me. She was just being really supportive, and the British Embassy that time did actually send an Arabic lady who was a translator, and it was actually really such an anticlimax. We walked up to this board and she found the case number and she just said, yes, they're guilty. And that was it. And I was really shocked, is there not more to be said? But no, that's it. The judge had found them guilty. And then I think we had to wait a while for sentencing. And the judge said that he wanted to sentence them to 15 years because of the severity of the crime, but actually they only got 10 on account of their age, which I don't think is relevant. I think the fact that they were doing this in their early 20s is indicative of the type of people that they are, and it's extremely worrying if men are prolific rapists at that age. I can't imagine what sort of rehabilitation programs they have in Dubai jail. But honestly, I felt exonerated, and speaking in terms of justice, I felt like justice had been done. I felt like that was an appropriate sentence for the crime. And this whole time that the court case and the trial and the police investigation had been going on, I must have been in survival mode. And looking back on my behavior, I thought I was putting this facade on and wearing this mask to the world, but I actually don't think I was doing a very good job. I think I was severely traumatized. I had PTSD for sure. And it's a shame that I didn't get any mental health support or any doctor support to help me navigate that process. But there was a huge relief in knowing that the men had been convicted and that I wasn't then going to be arrested afterwards. But even after securing a conviction, walking away from something like that, you can't just go back to normal. You can't just go back to your normal life. How do you begin to recover from something like that? I mean, I went away traveling, which is what I always do when I'm going through something stressful or difficult. As soon as that case was closed, I went off to Southeast Asia and spent a couple of months just decompressing. But I don't think I did enough work on my mental health. I didn't know how to do work on mental health. I had no one explaining to me how trauma impacts the body, how trauma lives in the body, how it impacts sleep, your mood, potential depression, anxiety. I was just doing my best and surviving. And again, you're probably still thinking, why the hell didn't you leave? Now that you have this conviction, why didn't you leave Dubai? But I had a really good life there. I'd been living in the Middle East since 2008, 2009. I lived in Egypt first. I had a successful event business from the UK that I started at 21, and I moved the business out to Dubai. And it was a completely different ballgame there. I was working with royal families, huge sporting events like the World Cup, Formula One, big budgets, big productions. I was really thriving in my career. I was making a lot of money. I was living in a beautiful villa. I'd recently bought my dream car, which was an Infiniti FX35 that I loved. And everything was going so well for me there. It felt like it would have been letting the rapists win if I gave all of that up. I would have had to sell everything. I would have had to leave my villa and sell all my furniture and go back to the UK. And honestly, my life in the UK wasn't that great because I had come from a very dysfunctional background and I had been a victim of abuse throughout my childhood. And I was the black sheep of our family dysfunction. And I had grown up with a lot of negative projections on me from people in my family. The common narrative was that I was a failure and that I wasn't going to amount to anything. And it's one of the reasons why I became hyper independent and why I overworked. And this is very common for women, especially that have been told they're not good enough or that have low self-worth. We try to find worth in things that we do and things that we achieve. So my business success was my anchor and it was my link to my self-worth. And I also had a great deal of financial freedom and I wasn't prepared to give that up. And I still don't think it was necessarily the wrong decision. You know, I had done this impossible thing. I had got justice. And conversely, I felt safe in the country because it was the CID investigation that was the reason those men were convicted. The CCTV in that part of the world is so sophisticated that it's able to focus on a pin on the floor. So because I didn't remember anything from the event, they found those men in the bar. They knew which bar I was in. They found them on CCTV. They used the cameras to follow the car as it followed my taxi to JBR. And then they saw them on CCTV dragging me out of this taxi, driving me back to their apartment, and then they have footage of me 6 to 8 hours later escaping. And had I gone to the police in the UK, not to criticize the UK police at all, had I gone in and said, I think I've been raped, but I don't remember anything, I don't think they would have been able to do anything because they don't have the same level of surveillance that they do. So this is one way in which a police state and a benign dictatorship actually worked in my favor because it was so simple for the CID to find these men, and they raided their apartment. That's how they found them in 6 hours, because they raided their apartment because they knew where they were. So I actually felt safe because the men who did this to me were off the streets and in jail, and after jail they'd be deported. And I wanted to stay and continue living my life on my terms. I felt as though leaving Dubai and returning to England would have been returning to this toxic family dynamic. And it was really when I escaped the UK and I moved to Dubai that I started to thrive. And I started to shake off the conditioning of my family. And conditioning from your childhood is so important. If you look at things that are happening to you as an adult or things that are around you that you're not happy with in life, it usually comes from your conditioning, from your upbringing as a child. And your family dynamic becomes your blueprint for life and relationships. And my mother had died when I was 3, and my dad introduced a stepmother who was narcissistic. And she was the main person who abused me throughout my childhood and conditioned me to believe that I was worthless. And unfortunately, that hierarchy to some degree had been replicated by other people in the family who I now have no contact with. And escaping that and allowing myself to be free was so important to me that I had no intention of ever returning to England. So I made the choice to stay in Dubai. And I also thought that there was a real potential to do good, because out of all the women who didn't receive justice, I did. So maybe I had all these ideas that I was going to work with the UAE authorities or work with the police. So it's like in an advisory capacity or as a consultant. And they weren't interested in having me work with them. I don't think they wanted me in there poking my nose around. They were just happy that this case was dealt with and, you know, they could move on. But I was able to help other victims at a later stage, women who'd been assaulted in that part of the world. And I was able to give them with moral and legal support and help navigating the newspapers. So all in all, I had this result and I wanted to carry on with my life. But I do wonder about the connections to the traumas in my life. I'd not just been a victim of child abuse from my narcissistic stepmother, but I had also been a victim of child grooming and sex abuse. And I had a series of dysfunctional and abusive relationships when I was younger. And I wonder if I had become conditioned to accept or seek out traumatic scenarios. And I don't mean this to sound in any way, shape, or form as if to suggest that victims are to blame. There is no blame or shame on this podcast. It is a blame and shame-free zone. But I think it's important to know that when we talk about the cycle of abuse, it's because people are conditioned to accept certain scenarios and accept situations that they wouldn't necessarily if they'd come from a healthy family dynamic. So I had lots of things to question. I had lots of things to work on, but I probably wasn't mentally and physically ready to work on them at that stage. I just tried to get on with my life. I tried to go back to normal. And as a way of, I think, showing this kind of facade that I have, I love to put on this pretense like I'm this strong, confident woman. I've got everything together. You know, I can deal with this court case and I can smash it and I can go on and be really successful. I then had to do something to prove to myself that I was worthy and that I was absolutely crushing it at life. So about 9 months after the court case ended, I decided to apply for The Apprentice, which is just crazy when you think about it, because I really had no business doing a reality TV show that was also going to be hugely traumatic, but that was quite typical of me. I'm just going to disregard the trauma. I'm not going to dive into that. I'm not going to unpack anything because I didn't want to sit with my uncomfortable self. All of my coaching and NLP and hypnotherapy work I did was much later in my life, so I had no capacity to deal with this level of emotions. So instead, I squashed it all down and I thought, I'm going to dive into something that's really high achievement, and I'm going to, you know, be hyper independent and an overachiever again, because that's going to be the salve, that's going to be the balm to my tortured soul. And that also ended up being really traumatic, of course. And in episode 5, I will be talking about going on The Apprentice. And in episode 6, I'll be talking more about my childhood and how I feel like that has shaped me and made me susceptible to predators and abusers, and how I was able to break that cycle for good. So if you'd like to catch up with the future episodes, you can subscribe on the button below. I really hope this was helpful to you. And if you're a survivor, I'm thinking of you. And always remember that nothing good comes from staying silent. And I hope you find your voice, and I hope that you say it louder. Thank you.